Hello, this is Mark Mitchell again, and be looking today at Chapter 9, and Chapter 9 deals with stratification and social mobility in the United States. And to me, this chapter begins a series of the first of three that really talk about some of the same things that are mentioned. It's just our focus changes a little bit. So stratification is something that we'll be looking at, for a few more chapters. So it is very interesting and important. And anyway, let's get started. So anyway, the chapter looks at the different systems of stratification, the different perspectives. These are really emphasized, and those are our big three theories of sociology that just keep popping up every chapter. All right, and then we want to look at whether stratification is universal, and so that even speaks to the really one of the sociological perspectives that was mentioned just prior to that. Stratification by social class, income and wealth, poverty, life chances, which is something kind of new to our author in this textbook, but we'll get to that shortly. And then you can see the social mobility and then some of the social policy, and then in the workplace with executive compensation that illustrates some of these concepts very well. All right, progressing on here to the next slide, we see about social inequality. Some good questions to get us thinking about this chapter, and hopefully by the end that we'll have an answer. But is social inequality, and talking about whether people are treated the same or not, and a lot of these aspects and variables that we saw on the previous slide, so income and wealth and prosperity, for example, is it an inescapable part of society? And so that's a very good question. It is, I would say, yes, it is inescapable there. It's basically been throughout human history, but we'll see some other points to that. And some could even argue that, in the earliest of human societies, if we ever had equality, it was very close then. All right, how does government policy affect the life chances of the working poor? And that's something really that's been discussed in our society here recently, and it's ongoing. Does everyone have a fair shot? And then, once we talk about our own society, then of course it's not far behind when we talk about the world at large. All right, and then one last question there is this country still a place where a hardworking person can move up the social ladder? So really, I guess a twist on the same aspect of the second question, that, is it fair if you put in the labor? Traditionally that has been very descriptive of America there, that it was a land of opportunity, but you had to seize it. So another issue there that we want to consider. Our next slide here just gives us some basic definitions so that we're all on the same pace, or same page here rather. Whoops, let me take this down. All right, but social inequality here is just simply different levels, and think of maybe a pyramid or something close to that, but where you have different levels, and that's how people are located, from the top to the bottom or bottom to the top, ever which perspective you prefer. If you've ever had a geology course, you know that the earth is also stratified in different layers, so that's another good way to think of it, or something to keep in mind as we're talking about it throughout this recording. All right, so stratification there does talk about how we rank everybody in a society, and usually those rankings are somewhere from 4 up to 7 levels. So they'll have different names, but the one thing they do have in common is it looks at everyone, and then it does our top to the bottom and everyone in between. All right, so income and wealth are more familiar terms there, but salaries and wages, and then wealth is more, I guess, of a series of years of income there, but what you accumulate throughout a given period of time or your lifetime. Still here with stratification, but we have two types of social positions. We had seen a little bit of that earlier with our discussion on status and roles, but in the scribe status, there again is a social position in which a person they're assigned. They don't have a choice. It's not voluntary. You're just in it. So your sex, your race, those are really good examples of that. Sometimes if you have a master status of an illness, that could also be ascribed. Some people are born with all kinds of difficulties there that they had no choice on whether, were asked whether they wanted that or not. So all of those fit into the ascribed status. The achieved status is one that you invoke effort, invoke choice in order to get something that's desired. And so now think of these two terms in our overall theme here of whether it relates to income, education, wealth. Some people would say, well, if you're born in an industrialized nation like the United States, Australia, or Japan, you're getting some things there just because you were fortunate enough to be born in a rich nation like one of those. You could have the same person with the same talents and abilities and born in a third world country, and look how their life would be affected, their income, their education opportunities, really much different. And it's simply because of the difference in these two terms, where one without choice and one with choice. All right, now when we think of stratification, these are also some terms of slavery, and I think for most Americans you might think of the history of slavery in the United States that affected African Americans. There was a terrible time there in history is maybe the first and foremost thing that comes to mind, but slavery is something that's been around as long as the world has, and it's taken many forms. A lot of them do revolve around economic issues where one group of people will enslave another or treat another in a horrible way based on financial opportunities that they can reap for themselves. All right, now we do have caste, and that goes back to one of our major stratification systems that'll be in this chapter, and hopefully we'll get to it in our slides today. But it is a caste system as compared to a class system, so one that is relatively closed, no room for movement. That's the caste system there, and here on the slide it's called fixed and immobile. So you're born in it, you can't leave it. It's just really in places where people are used to that idea, and they really don't think of that changing in any way unless they really want to get out of there, if that's possible. Where in the United States we have something called a class system, and that is where it is not fixed and not immobile, where you can go from rags to riches, for example. Then we can think of many people, Oprah Winfrey, Michael Jordan, and on, of people who came from very humble beginnings and made it big through their own efforts. And then one last term here is states, and in feudalism as well, but think of the Middle Ages there. But another hard way of life that people had, during the Middle Ages. Now, one additional thing to think of is, I know with slavery in the States, the Middle Ages and shortly thereafter, the 16 and 1700s for slavery. We often think of that as something that has passed and gone, and just a terrible portion of time in our history or world history. But slavery still goes on today, and so the two major forms that I know of would be through sexual exploitation, and that's something that really affects females more than males, but that certainly goes on, and actually child sexual exploitation is something that's big too. Now the other form of slavery, and this one may not go recognized nearly as much, but it is prevalent, but it's financial slavery. So I myself have several people that I owe money to, and I did that by myself and voluntarily, but until I pay them back, financially I am in their debt, and there are consequences that could happen to me if I don't pay that back, and that is maybe something that's often overlooked, but it is also important. Maybe not to the extent of the other cases that I've mentioned, but still nonetheless really a form of slavery. All right, so in the United States we have a couple good graphs here that show us all 50 states, and then where the income, the household income, so that's the chart on the left, the representation of the country on the left, The data is not really too old, so within the last 3 or so years. And then the chart on the right shows us, for example, the poverty level. And this is something that comes up several times in our slides, but it is really amazing how the richest nation in the history of the world, and talking about the United States, has poverty rates that are as high as what we see in our chart. So there on the right, up to 22% of people by the yellow color, according to our legend, are in poverty. And that is just really staggering, at least to me, to think of that in a nation that is so wealthy, not just in terms of today's living, but for living, in the Earth's history. Why is it so high? That's another good question for our 3 sociological perspectives that I think we could bring into play. So the structural functional would say, and I know this sounds kind of strange, but some amount of poverty would be useful. And we'll look at that a little bit later too. All right, another graph here in our book that goes along, or the slide that goes along with our book, is about human trafficking. So that is, deplorable human conditions. But oddly enough, now this chart was compiled by our State Department, and so, we don't even see the United States up on this chart, but it is assumed that they're in this full compliance Tier 1 column all the way over to your left. But that is strangely odd that the United States is not actually listed. So we can see some countries here that are in some of the lower categories, constantly in the news, like Iran and North Korea, and so they are kind of lower on the human rights and trying to rectify some of these situations. Another interesting graph here included today. All right, so more specifically about social classes. We've looked at stratification for the slide so far. Now I'm going to switch over to social classes. And so we do see the class system, and that is what we experience in the United States, but the key component to remember is the achieved characteristics, and that determines whether one, up or down, or ever how their social mobility takes it, but traditionally it has gone upward. And the bottom part here uses one of the more traditional ways of how we see social class and how it's measured, but usually something with an upper class, something of a middle class, working class, lower class, and then all kinds of further distinctions between those. All right, so summing it up, we see that, when we talk about the upper class, 1 to 2%, and we've recently come off some of the protests in which it was the 99% versus the 1. Well, the 1 is represented here by the upper class, and everybody else would be lumped together as the 99. All right, our graph here is a little out of, or it seems a little out of order because the lower class is listed next, and usually that should be on down. Then we switch back up to the upper middle class, and you can see where the working class is the largest by far, up to almost half of the U.S. population, and then the lower middle class would be also another big chunk, 30 to 35%. So those two alone, up to about 80-85% of the U.S. population. A population of over 300 and about 30 million. So that's a significant portion. Now the middle class is shrinking, and our next slide maybe gives us some reasons to think. So for example, education is very important, and if one does not have it, then opportunity shrinks. So that's our first issue to consider in terms of how the middle class is shrinking. What about global competition and advances in technology? That's also tied into education. The growing dependence on temporary workforce, and I'm afraid maybe even that'll be more prevalent in the future with some of the laws that have been enacted, and maybe an unintentional consequence of that is people will lose some of their status as full-time workers and be reclassified as part-time, maybe not temporary, but of course the big distinction there is benefits versus none. All right, that certainly makes one's financial future less certain, and could include more of the shrinking of the middle class. All right, and then finally, one other factor here to consider for the shrinking of the middle class is the rise of new growth industries and non-union workplaces. All right, now here's our slide that our first mention of the sociological perspectives on stratification. And so, those are our big three theories. That's our structural, functional, social conflict, and symbolic interaction. And of course, when we talk about these, we eventually going to come to Karl Marx, and so that's noted here on our slide. And he, of course, was the social conflict paradigm or theoretical paradigm, and he'll have more to say here in our presentation in the following slides. All right, here we go. But Marx, for example, is going to really focus on things are unfair. So it's really two sides that are in conflict. So that's the point of the theory with social conflict. On the one side, that you got the haves, and that's the capitalists, and they are the ones who own the factory. They have the wealth, and they control it all. In Marx's view, that's the big problem: is they have too much. Then on the other side of the coin is the bourgeoisie there, or the another name there for the capitalists. But now they are going to be the ones who control the working class. All right, so the factory owners, and then those who work in the factory, that's the proletarians or the proletariat. But that Marx would say is, it's an unfair rigged game to the detriment of the working class everywhere. And so his ultimate solution was to reorganize everything. No private ownership, really should be in some other hands other than private individuals. And so that leaves really little other choice than the government. And then that way you would everybody would have a fair share. All right, now further with Marx's views, we have class consciousness. And that's as opposed to false consciousness here. And now really what he would say is that people did have a false consciousness, and especially the workers. He would say that when they failed and did not succeed, that they would falsely blame themselves. They would have an idea there that their failures were a result of their own doings, or their failing to do, their own lack of competence. And he would completely disagree with that. He would say really what has happened is that this has happened as a result there of the way that the game has been set up, or the way that society has been set up, and it unfairly puts blame on the working man, the proletarians of the world, when it really we should be looking at those who are in charge of the production. Now, class consciousness here you can see, but it's the awareness of the interest and need for collective action to bring about change. So that's really what Marx talks about. It says, hey, wake up from this false view that you have and come to an accurate understanding of what's really out there, what's really going on, and if we're going to make our change, then that's the way to get started is through class consciousness. All right, now Weber's is next here, but Weber is going to be concerned with the symbolic interaction. That's where he fits into the big three. Now Weber would talk about class, the status, and the power. Those were his three big variables that he says we are to look at, and sometimes collectively these three are labeled into one now. That's SES, or socioeconomic status. All right, but let's just look a few moments at what he meant by class, and talking about those who are similar in terms of other variables, whether it be their wealth, their education, their income. So again, that might be your socioeconomic status, where you look at multiple variables at once that are very related to what Weber would talk about. Status group, again, is something that Weber was interested in. People who have, again, similar characteristics in terms of their lifestyle or prestige, social status. I know that's using the same word, but that's what he meant. And then power is the ability there to get others to go along with someone in charge. All right, now here we have just an idea with conspicuous consumption, but still on the interactionist viewpoint with Weber. But it's the idea that some people, have made it. They have arrived at the social position that they desire, and the toys and the perks and all that goes along with it. So not only do they know it, but here's where the conspicuous consumption comes into play, but they want you to know it as well. So they may buy things just as status symbols to others. So, think of the really luxurious items, the super big house, the boats, the cars, and what they say about, you as a person. Luxury, other items. I mean, I don't know what kind of shoes or maybe purses for women or whatever that, just you have to have in order to say something about you, or jewelry or whatever it may be. There used to be a commercial, you can probably find it on YouTube, but it was about Grey Poupon, and I think they were making that very same statement on this commercial in a joking way about conspicuous consumption. But you had two old white rich guys who were driving up in their limousines that were being chauffeured to a stoplight or stop sign or something like that. But anyway, they were eating something and they needed mustard, and this particular mustard was called Grey Poupon. That really doesn't sound nice to me, but anyway, it was the point, from the producers of this commercial, that our mustard, it is the king of all mustards and all that, high class. And so there's you another example if you needed one. All right. Now another phrase sometimes that maybe refers to this is keeping up with the Joneses. But there you go. All right. So is stratification universal? So yes, and there. If we wanted to maybe bring up an additional point to consider, is when we look at the types of societies out there. Hunters and gatherers. One of the characteristics there is they were rather egalitarian. Now, probably not completely, so I do agree with what this slide is saying there. But why do we have inequality? Is when one group has more than the other. So just to take my example for the hunters and gatherers, maybe this happened first between the sexes and then different groups. But once you have more than what you need, you are in a position of power, and of course you can enforce your will over that of another, because they're in a state of want, and you are in a state of surplus. All right, now one other point to consider here is, maybe one of the reasons we have inequality is because there are different jobs and tasks that need to be done that have requirements of a different skill level, and so those who can perform these tasks and have the skills, not everybody can do it, and so they should be rewarded at a higher level. So now, if you do have such a system in place, society regards this as fair. So think of a lawyer or a doctor and the salary that they would command. Not everybody has the skills to be a surgeon or to know the law. And so what if we decided, every job that a person has, they just get $30,000 a year and that's it? Well, how many people would study, for the 10 years that it takes to get through medical school and, have an internship, or the same thing for a lawyer or any other occupation like that you want to consider? Would you do it for that when you don't have to do all that to get maybe a job that pays you $30,000? Well, most people would say, hey, the rewards aren't there, so I'm not going to do it. Now, the last thing here on our slide is this does not explain the really big gap between the rich and the poor, and probably nowhere is that gap greater than in the United States. We have a lot of prosperity and wealth going around, but from the top to the bottom, probably couldn't find another nation on earth that has a bigger gap. All right, so now when we talk about the conflicts in the world, and this pulls in Karl Marx again, but people generally have disagreements. Now they do have disagreements over ideas, but what this slide here is pointing out to us is that most of the disagreements are over resources, and these are somehow necessary for living. And then of course there are some that just involve having more, or the wealth, or the status, or the power but there's a disagreement on how they should be allocated. Now that's where, Marx comes in and says, hey, we can fix all of this real quickly, and, by this, no one would really privately own anything or very little, and that way everybody would be equal, and then we have some other entity that decides what to do with the rest. All right, so that may work good theoretically or sound good theoretically, but then when you actually go about doing that, it's not as simple. So if Marx was correct and all that, that would have been done, I think, a long time ago. Now, places where it has been tried, it generally has not met with good results. What happens is that people wind up worse than before. So it's not, it's easy sometimes to identify a problem, but the solution that you use to fix it is not always nearly as easy. Okay, so we can think of many disagreements throughout the world. So, for example, the Middle East, but they have been in conflict for a very long time, and it has to do over the valued resource of land, and so they're still fighting over that, disagreements over that, and probably nowhere close to solving it. But this is, for example, all in keeping with the conflict view. All right, so we do see some ideas that are dominant, as the word or the phrase indicates here at the bottom of the slide, but there's some beliefs and practices that help to maintain the interest of who? But the rich and the powerful and those who are already in charge. Now, Gerhard Linsky is mentioned here next on our slide, but his idea is that technology is super important for societies, and when we see advances in technology there, we see a super ramp up in the production of goods. Now, the bad side of that is a greater inequality. The little bulleted item right under the bolded part is you're going to find that the differences between these groups, whether it's based on gender, sex, race, age, whatever, it's going to be greater and greater because some people have a whole lot more. Now, on the positive side, some of the world's greatest advances, and certainly during the agricultural societies would be a good example, but writing, the wheel, numbers, a system of currency as a change there from bartering, all of these took place during that time, but yet that's probably the single greatest time of inequality in history. Any type of agricultural society, the inequality there is actually greater than an industrial or post-industrial society that we might see today. Now, the productivity is not as great, but yet, when you first start up, ramping up production, that would be true. Now, think of some revolutions that we've had. So one would be the Industrial Revolution, that's closest to us in time, but it's just a different way of doing things and being more productive. That has actually led to less inequality there because of machines being used rather than animals to really make us productive, and just the flow of information is so great today. All right, now here's our three theories kind of in review in summary of the last several slides. But you can see across going from left to right in the top, the functionalist, the conflict, the interactionist, and then going down there also over on the left and going down, some of the comparisons between those three. So just look over those. We've looked at them already, but you can read that on your own. All right, let's look at stratification in terms of social class, and we mentioned that was the United States, as we do have a class system here in the United States. Some familiar terms, but we're looking at this objectively, or using the objective method. And so we're going to look at different types of variables that look at the prestige and esteem of those in it, such as the education, their occupation, their income, where they live, and where they're located. And I'm going to see a chart here in the next few moments that really ranks some of these occupations. All right, so when we look at occupational prestige, gender is done, and as I mentioned earlier, there's another slide that's a little helpful for us and maybe surprising in some areas that does rank some occupations. And then there's that variable I mentioned earlier, the socioeconomic status, but it's kind of a one variable, but it's compiled of several other variables there like income, education, occupation. All right, now here's our ranking of occupations. So surgeon tops the list, and again, this is some data that was collected about 3 or 4 years ago. And 100 is our top score, 0 is our bottom. So there's actually some surprising rankings, at least to me here. Panhandler at the bottom. That's kind of the fact that it has any prestige at all seems kind of strange, and same thing for a prostitute, but there may be others. Seems like college professor seems to be too high, but anyway, this at least gives us some type of ranking there to help us define, or if we agree with it there, how prestigious some of these things are or not. All right, so with income and wealth, that was one of the things mentioned on our introductory slide. And it just tells us here of how income in the United States is very unevenly distributed. Now, it mentions our recession there from 99 to 2001, and of course it doesn't mention the one from 08 to ongoing, but how some classes of people, their income fell a whole lot more than others. So Hispanics and African Americans fell about 25%. And while with whites there's actually grew. Well, where you hold your assets is probably part of the reason for that in that drop. And of course there'd be other variables that our book just doesn't just tell us. We know the end result. All right. Now, and we also have one other little box there at the end of the slide, but in 2009, half the population controlled more than 97% of the wealth. So here it's broken down into segments of 20% in this chart. So that's a little bit better perspective to help us. You can kind of see where you rank. Now this is talking about the wealth in the United States, and it's usually by household. When we look at the other charts, they were done by household as well. All right, so with research today, we're looking at work there that is becoming sparse. That's the idea of precarious work, is it's not really readily available. It's harder to get a job, find a job, keep a job, and of course with the salary that one wants and the benefits and all that. And so it probably wouldn't be hard for us to recognize somebody that we know that's been unemployed or trying to find full-time work, something of that. If you get a chance, go to a website or do a search for U.S. Debt Clock. I think it's .org. But anyway, when you get there, one of the things it does tell you is about the unemployment statistics in the United States. And a lot of the figures sometimes that we hear and read about, they're just not accurate. But I think the site that I mentioned does give you a more accurate number to look at, but there's a whole lot of other information there too, including our national debt, state debt, all that stuff. But U.S. Debt Clock, if you get a chance, just look at it. It's really a scary website to me because of all the horrific news out there that's on it. All right. Now, when we talk about jobs, of course, where poverty can also happen if we don't have a job and the income that we need in order to support ourselves or our families and the things that we need. Hopefully that we have only experienced, if we've experienced either of these, is relative poverty. So that is, when you compare yourself to others, so hopefully maybe our comparison's awfully high, like the Joneses or the conspicuous consumers, and they just have something that we don't. Maybe it's a luxury item or a leisure item, and not really life-threatening. Now, absolute poverty is it's a lack of resources there that sustain one's life, and so maybe really reminiscent to our picture that we see on this slide as well. Now, I don't I guess if I've been in either one, it would be relative. I've never been in absolute poverty there. So, but that is a way of life for some people, unfortunately. But I'm not sure about the exact number. But there's on any given night in the United States, there's either 1 million or more people who have nowhere to go to sleep, and they have to find it wherever they go. So that is a really terrible way to live. All right, so who are the poor? And here, just from our data, and usually it's about 3 to 4 years old, a lot of the, or most of the poor you're going to see are young adults. Now, in the past, the part of the poor, or the part of the population that was most likely to be poor, was the elderly. But then in the 60s, we had some legislation passed that really took care of that. Children are also another group that are likely to be poor, but yet we have some legislation that's helped with that. So now, young adults there, so a lot of people who are struggling are actually working, they're actually employed, it's just their jobs don't pay enough. And so that leads to a discussion, what would be a livable or a fair wage. I know with some of the Occupy protests, that's what they were complaining about is, hey, we need a living wage. We need a wage where people can work one job and make enough from that one job that they don't have to worry about some of these things. Now, some of their other demands were really unreasonable, such as, all your debts would be eliminated overnight. And, that sounds great, but that would cause absolute chaos if we did that. I mean, people would never make loans again if something like that happened. Now, another great group of the poor, another group that suffers quite a bit, is listed here under the feminization of poverty heading, but that is, for example, women. And some of the jobs that women have traditionally have paid lower than jobs, or the same jobs that men occupy. And so we could go back maybe to the prestige slide that we had earlier and see, a lot of those careers that are higher probably cater more towards men. And actually in jobs or occupations that traditionally were filled by women, when men enter them, they become more prestigious. So, when we think of cooking, you may think of that being primarily something that a female should do. But now when men get involved, it's chef so-and-so, and then, it really receives kind of something like an upgrade to it. All right, underclass is also mentioned on this slide, but those who lack training and skills, long-term poor, that just never seem to get out of that position. All right, with some of the additional notes here on poverty, according to our textbook, not a static social class, but really permanent is, I think, what really pointing out here. Some of the other things to consider, a lot of the jobs that no one else would do are performed there at low cost. And there we also see some additional things to consider there. Creates jobs that serve the poor, upholding conventional social norms, higher status of more affluent. Now that's interesting because that keeps the social order the same, the status quo the same. We do a little bit to help those who are in need, but really not a whole lot to really kind of change their plight. But yet those on top are going to stay on top. All right, here's another graph, and this is shocking to me, but of all the countries that it mentions, the poverty rate is the highest according to our book here. Where? But here in the United States. So that's surprising, with the next country on the list, with Mexico, for example, that the minimum wage there, if we compare it to the United States, is more than $2 lower. Now, Sweden has the lowest poverty rate according to our graph, but yet they have a very high tax rate, so they have a lot of programs there to help people when they need it, but yet anywhere from 40 to 60% of your income is going to be used by the government in taxes to create a variety of programs that are there to help you when you're unemployed or sick or what have you. All right, so further little exploration of who are the poor in the United States, and these are some striking numbers, and especially when you look at the race and ethnicity part and the family composition part, where poverty is kind of high. That's what the categories are saying there, but just showing that whites suffer poverty to a lower degree than blacks and Hispanics and Asians and others. Now, typically, Asians and others, their income as a group is higher than whites, but that's kind of surprising on this. But generally speaking, there's more percentage-wise blacks and Hispanics suffering in poverty. Numerically, there are more whites because there's just more whites than any other group. That's what our chart is also showing us. And then also the one thing about family composition that stands out is better to be married because two incomes work out better than one is what they're showing us. All right, moving on there, but Weber looking at class and the relative opportunity structure that people have, and so I think this can also tie back to some of the theorists that we've had in previous chapters on deviance. But Weber talks about the life chances there, and then also the more that you have, the more affluent you are, the better chance you have of surviving, generally speaking, because you have the resources to maintain. Social mobility really refers to whether you go up or down into the affluent category, or maybe not as high as affluence, or you go down. So it can refer to either positive or negative social mobility of some sort. We mentioned there with an open system, that's really our class system there, but where you can, on your own efforts there, make it or not, if you live in a place where that system is applied. And then a closed system, in some nations, typically they're going to be agricultural societies where hard labor is needed, and so we need our citizens to be, good, dutiful people there to provide that labor, and just very little opportunity to ever get out of your class, your social position in that land. That is a caste system or closed system. All right, so I mentioned this earlier on one of the other slides, but horizontal mobility, it's, for example, where you kind of really stay about the same level, no real big changes either up or down, but pretty much the same. So is that what we have to look forward to the future? Now, in the past, we had intergenerational social mobility that was generally upward, and that's been about the last 100 years or so. So have we reached a peak to where the upward mobility is no longer going to be there, and that would best fit in under the vertical side? All right, so you can go up or down, but generally speaking, in the U.S. over the last 100 years, it has been upward social mobility. You did better than your parents did better than your grandparents, but really starting about the year 2000, people have become really more pessimistic about their opportunities or the opportunities for their children in the future on whether they were going to do better than the parents themselves. All right, so just here when looking at social mobility, just some other characteristics to keep in common. So keep in mind rather, but we have education, how that affects social mobility, race and ethnicity, and of course gender. All right, so here's another graph, and it's really showing us kind of one thing. If you look at the first graph on the left versus the graph on the right, those are just really the two things I wanted to mention with you or talk to you about. But really, the first one on the left just shows us that really only about 7% of children who begin in the bottom quintile, the bottom 20%, reach the top quintile as adults. All right, that's the rags to riches. So that's really kind of what it's saying to us. I know it's kind of maybe hard to see. It's really kind of packed together and all that, but that's interesting to see. Now the other thing is at the far right, But 11% of those who start in the top quintile, they will fall about to the bottom. So that's here on the right, and that's what I just mentioned. And of course, the other statistic was coming here from the left. All right, a few more questions here. Social class and financial aid. Generally speaking, if you're going to college in the state and you're a resident of North Carolina, you're getting some type of financial assistance, and I base that statement on that you would be having to pay a whole lot more if the state was not already contributing back to your educational institution. So I guess the flip side of that is, you're paying taxes, so you're already contributing to that money as well, but it would be a whole lot more expensive that way. Now, here on the graph, we kind of see a different idea, but if you're actually receiving financial aid, would you still be able to go to college without receiving aid? Or, if you say you went to a private institution like Duke or Wake, where it's about $50,000 a year in tuition. Mayor Michael Bloomberg recently said, he said, well, college is not such a good deal anymore for young people. You should instead get you a job. And he actually mentioned the job of a plumber versus going out and spending, $50,000 a year for a job maybe that's not going to pay as well as a plumber. And of course, you don't have all that debt to pay back. So, kind of some interesting comments. Of course, he's had a lot here recently of interesting comments and things that he has brought to attention. All right, so executive compensation, their pay has exploded. That's really the short version here of slide 39. And we could see it's just really amazing how much people are compensated who get to the top. And really a lot of it is not whether they do a good job or not. So I could give some examples there of during the financial bailouts, people, when they were fired, got golden parachutes worth tens of millions of dollars. That'd be great, not to do your job, not to be aware, and still leave with a package that is just, like the figures we see, 300 times the average or more. All right, so our last few slides here, winding everything down, how can we apply what we've studied and learned here in the chapter about stratification, about class systems there, to sociology and to our everyday life. So that would mean revisiting our three big theories. And so the functionalist and conflict are given here, and now they're precisely applying that to the executive pay question that we started to look at. So some suggestions there. And then once we do that, maybe that leads to policy changes. And so some of those things actually did happen for a while when the U.S. federal government, and that means all the taxpayers, but their money was used to bail out these corporations there. And part of that was if you took the money, and a lot of them were encouraged to take it, then you had to change some of your paying of your top executives. Now, when you paid it back, you could change it to kind of however you wanted, but that was, some of the things. That's a good example of the applying sociology, I think, here. All right, and, well, of course, you know that maybe the executive pay, they could put limits on that, but if there's a will, there's a way, and companies, for example, they would say to attract top talent, we have to do these things, and so they might look to other ways to pay their executives these exorbitant amounts compared to most everyday workers. Okay, we are at the end of the chapter. I thank you for your time. I hope this has helped, and if I can help you in any way, just let me know. Thank you, and I'll talk to you again soon.